All right, our next session is about policy. We're going to have a conversation led by Sarah Schlesinger, and I'm going to set the stage a little bit and let Sarah take it from there. So Texas is growing. We are growing really, really fast. If we were a sovereign country, we would be the 10th largest economy in the world, worth over $1.6 trillion. Texas also ranks highest among states in the U.S. for business. With economic prosperity and low employment rates comes population rise. Texas ranks second among the states with weighing in about 30 million people, and we're projected to have over 51 million people by 2070. It's a very sobering statistics. With all those people, they're going to have to drink, right? They're going to have to shower. Hopefully they don't water their lawns too much, but it sets the stage for really what the challenges are for this state. And this session is specifically to talk about some of the policy surrounding some of those challenges. If y'all didn't meet Sarah last night, she was our advocate for the mural that we're launching. But she also, her day gig, I guess, is a CEO for the Texas Water Foundation. She was educated at Oxford. She is one of the bright young minds in water policy, and we're really happy to have her today. And I'm going to let her introduce her team. So please welcome Sarah and this distinguished group of legislators here.
Well, good morning. As we go into spending the day really talking about understanding water at the local scale, I find that it's really helpful to zoom out and understand what's happening in water in Texas at a statewide level, to put things into perspective, because I have found with water that where challenges are unique at a local level, they're also very much the same throughout the state, throughout the nation, and actually often globally as well. So before I introduce my panel and we talk about what's happening at the state, I have the honor of trying to synthesize the state of Texas water in 3 minutes. So bear with me. As Lewis says, the state is growing. We're growing astronomically, and that means, of course, all of the people and the industries that they're bringing with them are going to require more water than what we have available. At the same time, that population growth, I'm very happy to tell you, is not happening in Alpine, so rest easy. It is, however, happening within our urban growth corridors and places where water is not. And so we've got this tension that's occurring around growing water needs, decreasing supply, and we've got this new factor that you can talk to Dr. Mace about, increasing variability of when we have water, when we don't have water, when we have too much water, as we know in Texas. And also sometimes where that water is becoming less reliable. So in rural Texas, folks that have been mostly reliant on groundwater are starting to see that that is no longer as reliable. Now we have an additional factor now that is true in Texas, but is also true throughout the nation, which is that our infrastructure is aging and becoming more fragile, right? And that means that we are making less and less efficient use of the water that we already have. So as we kind of grapple with this supply and demand pressure that we're experiencing on a statewide level, we also are grappling with the fact that the bulk of our water infrastructure, meaning our pipes, our dams, our reservoirs, our treatment facilities, are nearing the end of their useful lifespan, and we're experiencing enormous water loss. And very fortunately, we also know that that infrastructure doesn't just mean our built infrastructure, but also means our natural infrastructure. Vanessa's very famous term that aquifers are also infrastructure, and our human infrastructure as well, our workforce needs. So this kind of brings us to the state of Texas water, where we're grappling with these big issues as a nation. All of our infrastructure is kind of aging and depreciating. We're dealing with those issues. So let's zoom out and talk about where we are as a state and some of the extraordinary things that our water champions have done for us in the past session and kind of looking forward. So with us today, we're very fortunate to have 3 water champions who have been invested in water policy, not just individually, locally, but really for the state of Texas. And so joining us, we've got Senator Perry, who is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Ag, Water, and Rural Affairs. We also have Senator Blanco as well, who's also on the committee. And we have Representative Tracy O. King, who's the chairman of House Natural Resources Committee. Join me in welcoming them this morning. So Texas has been really fortunate to have a number of dedicated water champions really over the course of the past 30 years. We're losing some of them. Chairman King, I'm looking at you. And really through all these 30 years of drought planning and groundwater policy and flood response, I'd turn to each of you and ask you, as you look out and back at water policy in Texas and reflect on the issues that are coming up in your state, what are the issues that are grabbing your attention? And Chairman Perry, I'd start with you. What are the things you've been quite a champion for the state of Texas in looking at water supply? What are the issues that are really grabbing your attention?
Well, I think the growth you mentioned, and I think that we all acknowledge the growth, but we don't want to acknowledge the fact that there comes some obligations with that. They're not bringing their schools, the roads, the bridges, and they're definitely not bringing their water or their electricity. Sometimes in talking to my colleagues, I sense that we're thinking from the vantage point that we're still a 10 million population. And so there's a lot of work that we've kind of shelved. As people do, they procrastinate until they have to do something. Water's not one of those things you can wait. When we need it, it will be too late to have it. Specifically, water supply. I've been a water supply guy from day one. I'm a private properties 101 guy. That's kind of the hill to die on. How you handle private property rights is you either create more of what they got for everybody else to have, so you alleviate the tensions, or you write checks for that. On water supply specifically in Texas and the policies that we have, there are undeveloped water supply. Undeveloped water supply. And Senate Bill 28 did that. Talks about how you develop undeveloped supplies. There are opportunities for marine desal, brackish desal, produced water out of the oil and gas desal, and then acquisition from other parts of this country that have said in the past they would sell us water. Some of those opportunities are only available when they say they're ready. If you wait 10 years down the road, they may not be available anymore because somebody else may have bought the water. So it's time to have the broader statewide conversations. What we do in water world right now is siloed to very community specific. So this community needs water today, and they look to the shortest, low-hanging fruit, invest as much money as they can afford to do it to patch it. When in reality, if they had looked regionally, if not statewide plan that we have a water plan, but it's not the supply plan that it needs to be. That's where my perspective is. The statewide water plan now assumes that 30% of the production in this state, as far as agriculture goes, will go away. Not mandated, but will actually go away because the water stuff. We have other water supply opportunities that we have to start having the conversation develop today, so that we're not depending upon an industry that we depend on from the budget perspective, and the world depends on for food, fiber, and fuel to have. I tell people the only thing that separates solving our water challenges of tomorrow is a commitment of resources and a vision today. It's one of the very few things that I have in policy world that I live in that actually money can't solve. There are undeveloped water resources, there are opportunities to acquire water from other places, and there is a national conversation I think that flows into that. I'm working in that world right now. But shame on Texas, shame on the nation if we wake up and we don't have the water we need to do what we're supposed to do and lead the world and the state, lead this country in economic, because we didn't have the vision of the resource committee. There are untapped water resources. One example, 3.2 billion barrels of brackish desal. To put that in perspective, that's 35,000 to 40,000 parts per million. That's what you desal when you pull seawater out. We're already doing it. The time is now. Is how do you build an infrastructure underneath that? How do you get it scalable? So it's time to have that conversation. That's what Senate Bill 28 started. It's a drop in the bucket, no pun intended. It was $1 billion. We need $500 billion over the next 50 years to meet this need, infrastructure and water development. But the challenge, looking back, so first of all, we are losing one of the guys that knows water. There's very few people in the state legislature that knows water, cares to know water, or even understands the need to have a conversation about water. As long as the taps run, nobody's interested. But I think that the window of having, because there are communities that have limited water supplies and recognize it. Those are those that think they have more than they can ever use, which is not true. We finally got a little bit of a foothold, but we don't have a lot of support in the legislature to have those conversations. But I'm committed to making this happen, and it's 50 years probably in the making, but you got to start somewhere. Commitment of resources, the supplies exist, go get them, develop them, and we got more water than we use for over 100 years. I'm pretty certain of that. So the time is now. That's what 28 was intended to do. The challenge is, as long as your tap came on this morning, the average person on the streets would tell you, why do I need to worry about water? And that's the biggest hurdle I have as a policymaker.
So of course, as we look at the state water plan, our fastest growing water use segment is municipal use, right? Because that growth is happening. But when we look at places like your district, right, which is really it plays a significant portion of the Texas economy, not just in ag, but energy. I mean, your district extends from the Southern Plains all the way down here. Water is such a key part, right? Texas does not run on oil and gas, y'all. It runs on water. I'm here to tell you that. So if we look a little further west, to your district, Senator Blanco, El Paso is one of those shining examples in Texas that has done the work of investing in diversifying your water resources, having a really secure water portfolio, ironically, in the desert. Tell us a little bit about the issues that are catching your attention in far west Texas.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here today. Yeah, El Paso has done a pretty good job. Keep in mind I represent from Fort Stockton all the way to El Paso, so we're pretty diverse as well. We've got a lot of ag, we've got oil and gas, and then some of the urban parts of the state. But some of the challenges that we're facing are our workforce in water. And when you look at the workforce currently in the state of Texas, not just in the state of Texas, but nationally, we're aging out. Very much like our infrastructure, our professionals are aging out of the workforce. The average age now is about 64. So we really need to, as a state, look at ushering in the new generation of water workforce. But there's some challenges with that because there's issues of competitive wages. There's not a lot of knowledge or interest in these type of jobs. For our rural communities, typically you bring in your water experts to help out on a project and then they leave. A lot of them don't stay. And then having that ability to create those programs or those pipelines for people to stay in rural communities to manage these water projects or wastewater facilities, etc. So those are some challenges that we're seeing, not only in our rural communities, but also in our urban places as well. So I think the state needs to look at not only college programs, but licensure programs and high school to workforce pipelines to ensure that we've got that available workforce in the future. When you look at Texas, there are some federal programs that are pretty good, but Texas A&M, specifically in San Antonio, has got a pretty good workforce development program specific to water. And then A&M also has a TEACS program that also provides a lot of resources and development for these young individuals who are interested in these programs. And there are some other programs such as the Texas TAWA has got a licensure program. It starts in high school. Someone who's in high school can get a certification and then go into the workforce right after that. And then the Texas Utilities Association also has an online program where people can get certified. But that's a big issue. The Senator has done a lot of great work on the infrastructure side and the funding side. It's really going into the future, but we also have to complement that with the workforce because someone's got to get out there and do it. It's not easy work, especially in Texas. We're having extreme weather, whether it's really hot or very cold. Folks get out there in the elements, and it's not easy work. So we've got to get folks interested. We've got to get folks motivated to do it. We've got to make sure that there's competitive wages, but more importantly, those programs and those career tracks to get people into that workforce.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's hard to get people to want to go out and deal with bursting, aging pipes, right? When it's a lot easier to sit in front of when Google will pay you a lot of money to be a warm body in a seat. So let's move a little further east. Chairman Kane, to your district. You have very different water challenges. You've also had a front seat for a while now on the development of groundwater policy in the state of Texas. And so I wonder if you would reflect on your view of the issues that are grabbing your attention on a state level, but also close to home, where there's more springs, right? More interaction with spring-fed rivers. But tell us a little bit about those challenges.
Well, thank you, and also want to join others in thanking you all for putting together this conference. And thank the Sul Ross State University for allowing us to use the facilities here. And so we do, the district I represent, the primary source of drinking water and irrigation water is groundwater. We also have irrigation districts that are served by some of the rivers. And we also have some irrigation districts that are served out of the Rio Grande River, and of course I represent Laredo, and the Rio Grande River is their primary source of water, only source of water. But with groundwater, well, I came into the legislature in the early 90s when the issue was the formation of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which was pretty much universally opposed by the people that I represented, but it passed overwhelmingly. And so then our job was to work with them as best we could, and I have found them to be very, very good to work with over the years. And they have done a good job implementing what was a unique type of legislation for groundwater districts. But, you know, the biggest challenge we see, the Carrizo Aquifer begins there in my part of the world. And one of the biggest challenges we see, of course, is declining well levels. And the Carrizo Aquifer recharges in theory, but it doesn't recharge on any kind of time frame that means anything to us. And so it's basically a mining operation, as are most of the aquifers throughout the state of Texas. Not all of them, but most of them are. And it should be no surprise that the well levels are going down. In the early 1900s, 1915, 16, there were tremendous land developments in the counties that I represent, all based around the fact that you could drill a well a few hundred feet and the water came up above the ground 3-4 feet. And so we had artesian water flow. And so they began doing a lot of small scale truck farms and those types of things. And within just 5 or 6 or 7 years, most of that had the water dropped below the ground, and they began having to pump it. So we've had declining water tables since the first wells were drilled in the early 1900s, and that trend continues. And so far we've been able to lower the pumps to get to the water, drill deeper wells and those types of things. But that is something that is a finite quantity, so to speak. People don't recognize it because, as the senator said, as long as you turn on the tap, water comes out and it's reasonably clean. People don't worry about it. And our hope and prayer is that we can convince and show people that that is an issue before they turn on the tap and they're just sucking air out of there. And that's a challenge to get people to respond. It's not human nature to do that. It's not human nature to do anything in terms of our health care or those types of planning activities before we absolutely have to. So that's the big challenge in groundwater. And in Texas, the groundwater is privately owned. It's a private property right, and I'm very, very protective of that. And so you have to try and strike the balance between the public need, the public good, and the private property rights issue. The growth of groundwater districts has been our attempt to do that. You know, people always ask, well, why did you create single county groundwater districts? Why didn't you create a regional district that covered the entire Ogallala or the entire Carrizo or the entire whichever, pick an aquifer? And in a perfect world, we would have done that. But we don't have the opportunity to legislate in a perfect world. We have the opportunity to legislate in what people's perception of reality is. And so we created the groundwater districts that could be created given the political environment that we had at that time, and operated on the assumption that they were better than no district at all. And I think in the vast majority of the cases that's true. Some of the groundwater districts we created, perhaps we'd have been better with no district, but the vast majority of them are better than having no district in place.
Thank you. So on a statewide level, of course, enduring supply and funding, workforce challenges, groundwater policy kind of sets the tone of a lot of the discussions that you're going to be having. But let's talk about the last legislative session. And I know that there's been about 12 special sessions since then, so it's hard to remember when that happened. But something really significant happened for water infrastructure funding. And so, Senator Perry, I want to just kind of circle in on that. So between the national narrative, where a bipartisan infrastructure act course corrected decades of a lack of any sort of attention to water infrastructure funding, Texas, I would say, not in usual form, kind of matched the national narrative a little bit in focusing in on that. So between the national narrative, the state of Texas water, and the fact that we had a historic budget surplus, how did you know that this was the session to focus in on water infrastructure funding that ultimately resulted in the allocation of $1 billion towards a new fund for water infrastructure? Can you tell us about what you were feeling, what you were seeing, and how did you get it to pass?
Well, so surplus obviously was the environment to get some infrastructure funding. Everybody came in with their $1 billion promise, and our $1 billion challenges, or $1 billion asks, and 18 billion went to property taxes, but different conversation. So everybody was thinking in the terms of billions to start with. We were fortunate to have that reality. I've been talking supply forever. Supply is one of those expensive propositions, right? So I knew that we would get something. I asked for 3. I got 1. It was an interesting conversation. The bill itself was on life support probably 2 days before session was over. I mean, we really never got confident that it was going to happen. And the reason we didn't have confidence it was going to happen is because you have conflicting interests that, well, I want more money in this area, or I want more money. And so you have those debates with your members. Chairman King on the House side and my side, we were able to convince people this was a start of something bigger than your district, bigger is the state. So we got past those, and then at the leadership level, truthfully, the question is, nobody was worried about water. When I talk to people in town halls, they don't ask me about water. I said, because specifically, these people think government would never not let their lights come on and never not let the taps flow. It's just something they think we're going to do. So with that, I gained some momentum, and we're fortunate to have it and get over the line. So the timing was right. Politics is timing. The money was there with the understanding this is just a jump start. So that bucket of money for water supply development. So it's currently in Texas, we call it water supply. Let's say Cesar has water and I want it, I can buy it from him. Fair market value, nothing wrong with that. It's a great concept, but we didn't increase any water supply in that transaction. And actually, Cesar just exported his community's future going forward. He just didn't realize it yet. So that's robbing Peter to pay Paul. And we're better than that. So I was able to convince people that there are other opportunities where we don't have to steal from one to the other or pay for one from the other to transfer water around and call it good. If you throw in the water plan itself, it's 7 million acre feet short if everything were to happen, and there's about 11 reservoirs in our statewide water plan that will never happen. Economically, regulatory, environmentally, they're never going to happen. And that's in our water plan today that we're banking on it to happen, so we're not 7 million short. So you add all the facts, and the facts begin to drive a narrative that most members are interested in. Members are interested in it. Some of my statewide, they're not interested in it, they just have other agendas. But the guys that are living in the water world, and there's not many of us, but then they're having communities that didn't have a water concern, they're running out of water now. So it's becoming to be a relevant conversation in the legislature. It's a hard one to have. Water is not sexy, it's long-term, and it's expensive. And those are 3 things that don't work in a 2-year election cycle. That's just the truth. Members are inundated with specific district issues, and you don't get an opportunity to have big visions very often. I've been screaming water supply. I think we finally got over the hump as what supply is and isn't. Moving water around is not supply. Developing new resources, putting water into the cycle that isn't there prior to that resource development is new supply. So we made a lot of ground, and we've got a stake in the ground to move supply conversation. The one bucket of money that there's 2 buckets of money. One went to infrastructure, leaky infrastructure. It's about 140 billion gallons a year goes through leaky pipes. 150,000 population under does not have a tax base anymore that can keep up with the cost of infrastructure. We have 8,000 water supply systems in this state. The majority of those are 3,500 connects and under. most communities cannot tax their citizens enough to catch up on the infrastructure. 70% of those pipes in the ground are beyond their useful life. So a large part, Chairman and I came to an agreement, 25-75. 75% of the $1 billion went to this fund to start the infrastructure conversations, knowing that the supply conversation is long-term conversation. So I said it this way, the 250 that's sitting in the supply bucket, in the next 50 years, if it had 20 projects run through it, I'd be surprised. But they're all multi-billion-dollar, millions of acre-feet conversations that are state, if not regional, for sure, impactful. So that's the purpose of that fund. I think we're going to go back in 25 and have some answers to questions that we've kind of had out there for decades or didn't know, to say that that fund's going to be utilized over the next X years. But it's for $1 billion. Corpus permitting on desal. It's a 50 million gallon a day plant. I think it was jumped to 100. I'm not sure what the status is. That is a $1 billion initiative that the state has to develop those marine opportunities. The state can't write that check, but it can leverage through credit swaps and some other things and actually fund some of those conversations so that the consumer at the tap can afford the product. And that's the state's role going forward. These costs are too big for 85% of the population in the state because they live in 85% of the geography that doesn't have a tax base to fund it anymore. So it's just where we're at. And a lot of people argue that's not government's, we shouldn't subsidize this community. If you want your fuel and fiber to come from the areas that I live in, that happen to be the top 3 budget items in the state of Texas, that is pushing us to the 7th largest economy in 25, you better make sure they have water, health care, and schools, or they won't be there to produce that stuff. So it's all tied together. Nationally, there's a new narrative, and we're having some success at talking to some folks west of the Rockies for sure, realize they are not water. They're water deficient this past couple of years. So there's a bigger play there, but if Israel can do it, shame on us. It's just a commitment of money. The technology exists today. We're talking about nuclear energy for the energy source to desal. That's 30% of your cost. If you get that right, you got that. We've got some new opportunities as far as moving water around. So in a big picture, because we had surplus dollars that weren't competing for Medicaid and public schools, we had an opportunity to put a stake in the ground. Senate Bill 28 put the stake in the ground and said, going forward, we're going to come at you every session to expand supply opportunities, and none of them are cheap. They're just big. 1 million acre feet, that's a multi-billion conversation. And we need 7 of those just to start. So that's where that fund's going to go.
It is so important to recognize that Senate Bill 28, Senate Joint Resolution 75, and then Prop 6 that recently passed with, just tremendous success, so congratulations on that. It's the first time in 10 years that the legislature has invested so significantly in water infrastructure. The last time in 2013 was the creation of the state revolving fund, right, which also went then to a constitutional amendment. So it's a big deal to have the legislature, for y'all to fight for the legislature to prioritize water. So I want to turn to you, Chairman King, and say, in order for Senate Bill 28 to pass, of course, it also had to move through the House. Your committees had to work very closely together. And coincidentally, you also formed for the first time the House Water Caucus, which had 73 members join in the first month of session. So I want to turn to you and ask, what were you seeing around the importance of Senate Bill 28? What did it take on the House side to pass a Senate-driven initiative? Again, not something we often see occur so harmoniously. But tell us a little bit about what was happening in your committee and the prioritization of water infrastructure funding.
Well, of course, it started well before the session. During the interim meeting, we had some interim committee hearings where we went and we talked extensively about the leaky pipes and the infrastructure, and some about the supply situation. But so we were building up to that. We knew we were going to have a surplus, and yes, both the JR and the Senate bill came out of the Senate, but Senator Perry's staff and my staff and Senator and I, we talked every day. I mean, it wasn't like they just passed the bill and sent it over and said, here it is. We knew what was coming before before it got there. And for a variety of reasons, I thought it would be good to start it in the Senate. But, and so we did that. And I focused a lot on the infrastructure because I thought that, because the senator's absolutely right, it's hard to sell that supply question. It's hard to get people to think that far down the road, and so we were pushing the infrastructure because that's an easier thing to sell, I thought, to people immediately, because we had to sell it to our members, we had to sell it to the leadership, and most importantly, you got to sell it to the voters at the November election. And so that was what had happened, and it ended up passing out of the House unanimously, both the Prop 6, SJR, and Senate bill.
So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, water is one of those, it doesn't tend to be partisan, which is really refreshing, right? But it does tend to sometimes experience tensions between urban and rural interests. Historically, that has been kind of the tension that exists. Chairman Perry alluded to the fact that sometimes fighting for water to be prioritized within the legislature is really hard. And so I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the caucus and why it is that you felt like it was the right time to do that, and what that means in terms of having a bench of legislators that are going to care about water into the future.
Well, yeah, thank you, and I meant to mention that earlier, so I appreciate you saving me from myself there. So we did several things. We had the interim studies. We knew we had a surplus coming. We spent a lot of time talking about the infrastructure because it was easy to sell. And then also we formed at a number of people's suggestion, you and Sarah, and Vanessa being the two primary ones, that we formed this water caucus, and it was very, very readily accepted, and people were glad to be a part of it. And that was all trying to build up this momentum and support to get this proposition passed and get that legislation through there, because anybody that's served in the legislature or been around it knows that you're not going to pass a bill like that that's going to satisfy everybody. And you're not going to get as much money as you need, but you need to build a momentum. So all of those things were built towards trying to get this prop passed and towards future awareness about the needs in the water world.
Well, thank you for doing that. Needless to say, we're heartbroken to be losing our longtime water champion at the legislature, but very grateful that you've set up a mechanism to make sure that we're building out the next bench, pipeline of water champions, as it were. So I want to pick on something, Chairman Perry, that you brought up around the affordability issue, right? And especially for our rural communities where you don't have the ratepayer base to really justify just the enormous price tag of some of these big water infrastructure projects. And I think it's important, as a state to realize that a lot of our water infrastructure was subsidized through those national, right, grants and funding, 50, 60 years ago. And so we really find ourselves at an inflection point as a state about how we fund this critical infrastructure that we need to ensure the continuity of our communities, of our economy, but also have to grapple with this affordability issue. So Senator Blanco, I want to just, beyond the success of Senate Bill 28 and the creation of the Texas Water Fund, we also know that there were a lot of, key sunset reviews happening, key state agencies going through sunset, and one of the really big discussions that happened specifically with Texas Water Development Board, the agency that will administer this fund that was created, was around how effectively were they getting money out to the communities that needed it, right? And El Paso has done just an extraordinary job of diversifying its water infrastructure, but one of the things that really kind of caught my attention is that just after session, you announced that the board approved a $28 million award for water and wastewater infrastructure in El Paso County through the Economically Distressed Areas Program, which is one of its programs that will receive now an injection of funds. Can you tell me a little bit about the significance of that and how you're seeing the affordability or, just kind of the cost element of funding all of this infrastructure?
Sure. First of all, we've got to give a lot of credit to these two individuals that I think this is separate from the property tax relief. I think this is the silver lining of this last legislature that I think is going to impact generations in the future. And it took a Democrat and a Republican to do it, to convince leadership how important this is, and to corral both the House and the Senate So as a younger legislator, our hats off to you, and hopefully this does inspire the next generation of legislators, because this is transformational, and we really appreciate it, and it's great for the state of Texas. And demonstrates how in touch they are, because that prop passed with 77% of the vote. So our hats off to you. Yeah, so SB 28 is so important, and the example that you gave in Montana Vista, which is a colonia in El Paso County, received $28 million for wastewater or sewer. This is an area that has been plagued with water issues for quite some time. There's a lot of environmental issues. There's no wastewater treatment out there. The sewers infrastructure was decrepit, and we were able to receive these funds, and it's going to be transformational. Using the funds to pull septic systems out and to provide this infrastructure that is going to be helpful for years to come. That's just one example, but SB 28 is going to be so important for other places in smaller communities. I've got a community out here named Toya. There's about 60 people who live there. TCEQ has had a boil ban, water boil ban for 6 years there. They've got some challenges. Their water source is surface, it's not ground. And that's a community that doesn't have that tax base to be able to fix the infrastructure there. So this bill is going to be able to help these type of communities and allow these communities to thrive because they have a water source. So those are two examples, one in a colonia and one in a small rural community where SB 28 is going to transform the future for these residents.
Thank you for bringing that up. Within the Texas Water Fund, this newly established fund, it's going to allow, as Chairman Perry said, that $1 billion, which we hope is just a deposit, right, into a new piece of infrastructure, pun intended, to kind of be distributed through all of these existing funding mechanisms. And the Economically Distressed Areas Program has been one that has not had a lot of money. And in our state water plan, Texas has done an extraordinary job of funding water infrastructure, but in some cases through our state revolving funds, we're 7 times, 8 times oversubscribed because the demand is just astronomical. So having these programs and seeing it be transformative and having more money coming in really will shape the future. So let's talk about what comes next. We've got $1 billion and the new Texas Water Fund, which is a great start, but just a drop in the bucket, as you said. I want to ask y'all what you're seeing on the horizon, what comes next for Texas, and as our departing water champion, Chairman King, I'm going to ask you, what do you think we need to be looking at next?
Well, thank you, and for that opportunity. And you brought up something about the state revolving loan program, which has been instrumental for all these communities. But that's a declining resource in terms of funding, because with the re-implementation of the earmark program in Congress, they have been earmarking a lot of that money, and one of their favorite targets for money is the money that used to come to the state revolving loan program, which is even more reason that the state needs to step to the plate and try and provide additional funding as future legislative sessions go. And so what comes in the future is, of course, because of the district I represent, groundwater's deal, I think that we need to recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that the groundwater tables are not going to recover for all practical purposes. At least while we're on the face of the earth, and I don't just mean my lifetime, I mean in general, but in most of these aquifers. And so what do you have to do is you have to spend, I think you got to spend a fair portion of this money to look at the interaction and do some deep data analysis on the interaction between groundwater and surface water. And that can be very, very controversial sometimes, but we can't just stick our head in the sand and pretend that it doesn't happen. And so we need to look at that, and that requires money to do those analyses. And so I think that that's what we need to do. We need to do everything that we can to encourage water conservation in positive ways that we can, and recognize, at least in my view, water that's conserved is new water. Water that you prevent from running down and being wasted through transmission lines is new water. And then you have to look at as Senator Perry has championed, you have to look at the produced water and the brine and those types of things, the salt water that's out there that in the past has just been considered waste. And we need to make that into potable water, or at least water that we can use. And I think that it's important to recognize that I don't know if there's any place on the face of the earth that uses water the way we do in the United States. We use a lot more water than anybody else does, other than El Paso and desert communities like Albuquerque. They know how to water conserve, but that's not in our mindset. That's not in our property development plans. But it's something that will come, and hopefully people recognize that before it's forced upon them.
Yeah, it turns out that we prefer carrots over sticks in Texas, right? I'm going to give y'all a heads up that in a moment we're going to turn to questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, so fair warning. But before we do, let's keep talking about what comes next. Senator Blanco, what are you seeing as next challenges? What are the things that you're wanting to focus on for water in the future?
So I think the technology, the upcoming technology, I think is important. We had an opportunity in El Paso. I serve on Project Bravo, which is a community action committee that helps individuals that don't have the resources to pay for utilities. But we were able to partner with this entity in Arizona that produces hydro panels. And we had a pilot project with 4 families in colonias in El Paso, and they set them up, and the program looks pretty great. They've got, I'll give you an example of one family. It's a family of 4, and these hydro panels, there's no infrastructure involved with it. It's just pretty much building them up. It's using light and the air to draw drinking water into these homes. And it's enough to produce enough drinking water for a family of 4 a day. So it's pretty innovative. I'm really excited about it. We were able to partner with 4 families to do it. One family said that there was enough water produced for even their dogs. I think the state should look at these, this technology for the future as well, because it's really expensive to focus on underground, and even some of the surface projects are very expensive. So I'm hoping that our state can look at some of these innovative technology methods down the road to help. We've got a lot of sun, a lot of open air that we could utilize to produce some of this drinking water. Now these families don't use all of that water for all their day-to-day, like washing clothes and washing dishes, etc. But it is used for drinking water, and it's sufficient for that day.
I find myself often using the analogy for folks who are new to the concept of water security that it's a lot like your financial portfolio. You diversify to reduce risk. Well, our water infrastructure is very much the same. We need to diversify the sources and the technology that's used, right, to reduce risk. And we are going to experience increasing risk as a state. So Chairman Perry, we know that interim charges are swiftly upon us. What do you see coming up? What are we going to do we get another? You're going to start another Senate Bill 28, or what's coming up next?
Well, I think first of all, I agree with education. The countries, as Chairman King pointed out, we don't have an appreciation or respect for water. Take it for granted. We start in your foundation and Vanessa's groups and people. We got to kind of get it into the littles mindsets, right? We started advocating for water conservation respectfully. Water conversation, not doing without, but not wasting. I think next session for me personally will be, hopefully the $1 billion will be committed, or at least shown that it will be committed when all the books and paperwork's done. And I'm going to ask for another. I think in addition to that, we have to treat water like we treat roads. Actually, I would say water is the most important of the needs. It's important to have power. It's important to have gas in your car, but I can walk and I can burn candles. 4 or 5 days in, my body shuts down without water. Everything starts and ends with water. So I hope, and I'm going to entertain it, we kind of pitched it last session, but that was too much for the bill, is to get a permanent funding source established. We do that with our roads and bridges. People don't know it. Senator Nichols actually been chairman of TxDOT and a bunch of stuff for years and years, became a senator, and the wisdom of the legislature with his push has now got effectively a perpetual source of funding for roads. We need to do that for water. We need to set that up where we've got a recurring stream. So it's not the political battle, especially when budgets are not there every session, because this has to be a priority every session. So I think I'll work on codes. I'm never going to force a building industry to do something. But to your point, there are lots of things and tweaks that builders can do in new community development. And if the states are smart in using small dollars, they can have big impacts. And I use the example, people are tired here. A recirculating hot water pump in houses, most new construction has them. You can retrofit them. $400 is the cost of that pump. For those that don't have one today, when you go home tomorrow and you turn your shower on, how long does it take for the water to heat up? And those gallons are just going right down in the drain and not used. So I've seen Israel's education programs. Guess what? They got the water so expensive that nobody would dare waste it, and they have rainwater harvesters on every home. This country, this state, this nation has to have a conversation about water. And it needs to start with education, because there's a lot of little things we can do that add up to big, big things. There's some things regulatory at the national level that I'm beginning the preliminary conversations from the federal, both D's and R's. And I think there's some momentum there to remove some barriers to let what we're trying to do in Texas go forward. Here's the good news. This is not a state issue. This has become a national conversation in a lot of parts of this country. The bad news is it's a national conversation in a lot of parts of the country because we have a water supply problem. Flip side, what I said very first, there are absolute solutions to fix our water supply needs in this state, these communities, and this country. It's just a matter of commitment of vision and resources. It's one of the few things you can fix with just money. Well, I've got the mic. Thank you, Sarah and Vanessa. I know what it takes to put this on. For the first one, I think they've done a really good job. And obviously, contrary to the narrative at some of my statewide levels, people are interested in water. And it's good for you guys to take out the day to be here.
I invite y'all to have questions. Do you have any burning questions? Let me see a couple hands up over here. This one went up first.
Thank you all for being here on the stage and talking with us here now. I had a question about the 11 reservoirs that are continually on the state water plan. Some of these have been on the water plan for decades, and I've heard that there's a recognition that there's 11 that some folks recognize will never be built because of a variety of factors. And I'm worried that there are folks in the general public that they don't know that. They think that, oh, those reservoirs are going to pop up one day. And so there's speculators going to these river bottoms, flipping land, foreign investors, and a lot of things happening in communities with these plans in the shadow that I think is possibly dividing some of these communities in bad ways that I've seen in East Central Texas and other places. Is there a future soon that we're going to see those 11 reservoirs get off of the state water plan and have a focus for other projects? Is that something that is on the shoulders of the water planning group? I need to do more homework on this question, but I want to...
Yeah, so here's where we're at. State water plan, when I started in 11, I think had 29, and Dr. Mace over there probably can correct me, 28, something like that. I dug into it because it's probably the largest water supply opportunity on mass volumes the state was planning for. And I wanted to make sure they were real because a lot of those were put in the books on the 70s, 80s, 90s. It takes about an average of 40 years to put a reservoir in place because of all the federal regulatory other things. So I said, let's do a little deep dive here, and we come up with, and I think they removed several. I think they dropped it down to around 22, 21, something like that. We actually had two, one open and one about to open probably shortly over in East Texas. And I forced the Water Development Board to go out there and communicate with those communities. And these were put in, but remember, by county commissioners or somebody back in the 70s. My mic's going.
I know it is. I'm afraid this... Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
So,
sorry about that.
these were put back in decades when those people are probably not even living. So, to the board's credit, they did go out and they did remove some, and in addition to that, I said, I wanted an update on every status. If there's one permitted, that's a good chance. If there's one that's not started permitting, we gotta be realistic. If it's been on the books by the 70s and it's not started permitting takes 10 years at the feds, it ain't gonna happen, at least in the confines of this water development plan. So we're down around 21, 22. The fair estimate is about 11, probably can happen. Not that they will, but can. And that still leaves you a deficit there that is kind of out there in no man's land. So I kind of called BS, and it wasn't to discredit a plan. The state of Texas leads the nation in water planning and showed how to do it. It's a good thing, but we got to be honest. 2% of the plan considers desal. Is that kind of pretty close? You got marine desal, brackish aquifer, brine aquifer, and you have produced water. Those are 3 desal opportunities that are thousands, if not millions of acre feet. Marine desal, in theory, is kind of in perpetuity, right? So I would rather switch to a plan that I know for a fact has an adequate supply that we can start developing technology today than possibly removing people from their homesteads at billions of dollars of conversation and legal cost that at the end of the day is still dependent upon rainfall. So what we're finding out is some of the newer reservoirs were expected to produce this much, and because of Mother Nature, it's going to have to downgrade to their contribution. So that's where we're at with reservoir. It's not a negative. I want to make sure people don't think that I'm negative on this. I just want to deal with reality. It's a plan that we're counting on to fund our water. If there's pieces of that plan that cannot happen, we should not count on it. That's where this conversation came up. And it was not warmly welcomed. I will tell you, people, well, you can't tell people because they're moving to Texas with all these big chip manufacturing and everything. They got to know. I'm not saying we can't get there, but we can't get there with what the plan we have today with what's in it.
Great question. Should we take another one? I think there was one over on this side.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Pam Hart. I have a question. So humans value what they pay for often. And water's free. Public water's free. If you have to drill a well, it's not free. But people pull out of the river and they open their tap. Do you ever see that changing in the state of Texas?
I do. You know, as the cost of providing that water to that tap continues to go up, those communities are going to have to get that money from somewhere, and so I do see that going up, but I don't see it happening overnight because what we have found is that if you raise people's taxes too quickly, they replace you with somebody that won't do that, and those people that come in, if they forget why they were put in there, then they get replaced. And so that's the ebb and flow and the balance in our system. But I do think you'll see the cost of water go up, I do.
Great question, Pam. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I am Jerry Kurtanka. I'm from El Paso. There hasn't been a conversation yet about the role of agriculture in this. In El Paso, 75% of our water is used by our farmers. They're growing water-intensive crops like pecans, alfalfa, even cotton, very valuable things and a valuable contribution, but that's 75% of our water. Is there a way that the farmers, our growers, can be involved in this conversation? It ain't going to happen overnight, but over a 10 to 40 year period of switching to less water-intensive crops, maybe even for local consumption. Thank you.
So the producers, farmers, are the best stewards of water because they have the most to lose if they run out of water. And they absolutely, through equip money loans of the past from the feds and different initiatives and seed technologies today, and cotton seed in Lubbock, Texas today probably takes a quarter of the water it took 20 years ago. So, and Texas Tech leads a lot of that agricultural research. So there are more and more and all the time consistently working towards less water usage on our production. So our farmers, I promise you, are probably the best example of stewardship, and we are better in this state than telling that industry they have to quit using 30% over the next 50 years so that we all have water municipal use, because the truth of the matter is that's probably not true. I mean, probably gonna, probably gonna lose an industry anyway, but I'm just saying, we have an alternative to that. So to your point, my farmers are engaged, they're usually the best stewards, and they're definitely not gonna spend any more utilities on that well to pull that water than they absolutely have to get a crop. Now, I will argue that the perverse way the feds have done their insurance programs of late for some of these crops forces a farmer to water a crop that they absolutely know will never ever make it because of weather, but they have to show a production cycle. So there are some opportunities, I think, to go in and clean that up, but I think if you go back to row water and open well pumping and things back in the 50s, when, to his point, the aquifers would just shoot water out of the ground up there, the Ogallala. There's pictures where people had 10-foot fountains coming up and we'd row water, crop row water. Those days are long since gone. Drip irrigation, a lot of those techniques are now is what's implemented. So it's not an industry's fault. If there were no other supply of opportunities, we'd probably just let the thing play out like it's going to. The fact that we have other supply opportunities, we should not ever put an industry in jeopardy.
What a wonderful question, and actually speaks so much, Pam, to yours about the price of water, right? The economy of scale of pumping water and producing ag, which is such an important part of our economy, I think is going to play out. We've run out of time, but as we close, and I hand it back over to you, because this is landowner focused, I encourage you, we've got elections coming up, I encourage you to talk to your representatives about how much they value water, make sure that they're interested and engaged, and join the Water Caucus. Shameful plug, but join me in thanking all three of these gentlemen for their commitment to water, for being water champions, for their service. Yeah.